a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to and meet again after some years, Tanya, who we have many shared memories of the department in some years ago. But I'll keep those on one side and start, Tanya, by asking when and where you were born.
Thank you. In 1959, in Dayton, Ohio, in the United States, at the edge of an Air Force base, a military base where my dad was serving it's called ROTC. There was an organization that would pay for your college education if you signed up for some years with the Air Force afterwards, and that's where we were.
Yeah. Tell me something about your ancestors. Some people go back to the Norman Conquest and some go back one generation. Many people talk a little bit about their grandparents downwards, how they might have influenced them.
That's a good question. My maternal grandparents were actually Baptists. Mm-hmm. They were missionaries in what was then Burma, and my mother was born as sort of the accidental child after they returned. My grandfather was very intellectually capable man, very good with languages, very loved riding on the backs of elephants. Went into these villages, and he was the dentist and the doctor. He loved that. He loved doing that. He wasn't very interested in converting people. I think he had a sort of capacious understanding of God. And unlike my grandmother, he did not believe that if one of his villagers did not choose Christ, that villager would go to hell. My grandmother did. And my grandmother was more difficult than my grandfather. I have one of my earliest, I think I was 6, and I have this memory of being in Staten Island where my dad, who's a psychiatrist, was doing his internship, and my grandfather took me around the park, went holding me on his shoulders, and it somehow really resonated with me. With a story of, Green No, which is an American, I think it was Ellen Boston. Actually, I think she's English, and she tells a children's story about Saint Christopher, who carried the child Jesus, and somehow the memory of my grandfather carrying me with kind of this precious care is really stuck with me. He carried me around the park while it was raining.
Well, we'll come back to Burma because my great-grandfather was there at the time too, in Burma at that time. But what about the other set of grandparents?
So those grandparents were my father's father. My father's a psychiatrist. Was trained and worked as a psychiatrist. My father's father was very brilliant and probably mad. My father hospitalized him twice when my father was just in medical school. It's not clear exactly what was going on. It sounds as if he was psychotic, that he, I'm interested in voices, and I like to, and I interpret the story that my father tells about his mother to mean that, so my grandfather at one point became very paranoid. He developed a method for canning, and he developed this idea, and then a different method became the industry standard. But my grandfather, at the end of his life, had this elaborate set of ideas, which you could call paranoid, that he was owed millions of dollars. And in the process, he began to behave a little oddly. At one point, he drove with my grandmother into oncoming traffic, as if directed. That was when my father went to hospitalize him. And he adored my father, and he just agreed to be hospitalized. And my grandmother was not frightened of him after that. My grandmother, that grandmother, had a huge garden. And I remember this image of my slow-moving grandmother in this what felt like acres and acres, beautiful, beautiful flowers. I also would have sworn at the age of around 3 to 4, maybe a little younger, that I saw the Easter rabbit in her garden. I have this memory of kind of looking out, and I kind of knew, but I mean, it was a big rabbit. It was on Easter. And so that's what I remember. They lived in this lovely old house that had been the stop for the stagecoach in rural New Jersey. And of course, by the time that I knew it, it was much closer to the turnpike.
So moving on to your parents, you mentioned your father was a psychiatrist, and you had a big interest in psychology and psychiatry. What else, in what other ways did he influence you, do you think?
So my father, for most of my academic life, has been my first reader. And so he was the person who, not really started with the third book, but he would read the book, and the third book was about psychiatry, and so he was intimately involved with that, and so he really cared about the sentences. But in everything subsequent, I mean, it's stopped, it's a little rockier now, he's a bit older now. But he would tell me, not so much, he would care about the ideas, but he was really helpful in telling me when he got bored and what he didn't understand, and it was immensely useful. And so I've had many, so that was very useful. And he was also the person with whom I tried out my first ideas. And he is also a very anxious man. He collects. He also doesn't throw things out. And so he was always very worried about the evidential base of any claim. And I think probably that became crucial for me, because when I thought I saw something in the ethnography, my father would want to know why, and then he would want to know how it worked. And so more than many anthropologists, I have pursued a kind of tried to explain things that I haven't been satisfied with saying, well, I just saw it. I wanted to show that it was true with other methods as well. And that probably came from a dissatisfied dad.
That's a big influence. And what about your mother?
My mother was a writer. She wrote over 40 novels. She published only one of them. And so I hadn't realized until she died just how many novels she'd published. So there's this I have a wall, or in the house in the house where my father lives, in the bedroom where I sleep when I visit, there is a wall of manuscripts, and some of them pretty good, some of them not so good. She wasn't a reviser so much, but she felt as if she sort of took dictation as she wrote, and so she would sometimes, I remembered driving with her, and she would fall silent, and I would say, what are you thinking? And she said she was writing in her mind. She sent me a lovely card, I think just when she was 80, maybe a few years after that, she said, whatever the age, magic happens, grab it.
That's very nice. Well, big influences there, and then moving on to your schooling. As we've got limited time, can you pull out a few really significant episodes in either your early or later schooling in terms of teachers or themes?
Well, it's I remember an incident in nursery school where I said something that was true to my teacher, that my father was going to pick me up at a certain hour, which was not the end of the school. And my teacher didn't believe me. And I remember sitting there with my little plastic birds, playing with them, and I was sort of put in a separate place because I was lying. And my father came to pick me up at the time that I said he was going to come and pick me up. And it was like, and that was really, somehow that really stuck.
Did the teacher apologize?
The teacher did. And so there was a real sense that truth mattered, that there was something that kind of... So that stuck with me. I remember being desperately determined to figure out how Euglena worked at one point in high school, and looking through, spending hours and hours watching the behavior of these little I think not paramecia, but these little single cell organisms in the microscope. I was persuaded for a long time that I was going to study the communication system of wolves, because they worked in a group, and I thought that was fascinating. I was quite taken with Konrad Lorenz and Ernst Thompson Seton and these kind of the world of the naturalists.
So when you went on around the age of 12 or 13, certainly in my case, in a lot of cases in England, a little older, you're baptized, or at least you go through a reaffirmation of your faith as an Anglican. And this is also the time that often people have their greatest religious interests. Do you remember, since you've been very interested in religion, when you first became interested in religion, and whether there were incidents in your school which reinforced that?
I grew up in a world of many different faith commitments. So my grandfather was Baptist, spoke words that suggested that there was a God that was kind of in. So he was a pastor. He was my grandmother was the pastor's wife, and he had a sense of an external Christian God who interacted with people. My father's parents were Christian scientists. That is a religious commitment in which medicine doesn't. You're not supposed to visit a doctor.
Yeah.
My father went to medical school. My mother remembers being horrified when her mother took over the church when my grandfather went to fight to be a chaplain in the Korean War, and I think it was the Korean War. Maybe I think it was the Korean War, and it was the Second World War, and my grandmother felt that those Baptists who hadn't accepted Christ would die, and my mother was horrified by this at a very young age, and so I grew up in a household in which my father went to church reluctantly to accompany my mother. My mother went to church, although she didn't believe in God, and she loved Sam Harris and died surrounded by books on faith. So Sam Harris is this famous atheist. In my own experience, at kind of Piagetian age of 16, when logic becomes really important to the developing mind, I decided that God could not exist because of the conundrum of if there's a loving and all-powerful God, clearly I don't want to believe in a God who has created this kind of universe. And so I became known at school as an atheist. So I was a kind of the school's famous atheist.
Interesting. And have some themes go on through life.
Yes.
What's your position now?
Well,
over time, has it evolved from being an atheist?
So I would say that, how would I say? I would say that I have a lot of room for the value of going to church. That sometimes the way I describe it is that, I think this is Matthew 18:11, but don't quote me. It's, there's a point in the Gospels where Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, where after I'm gone, when 2 or 3 of you are gathered together, there I will be. And I have studied for many years a kind of Christian to whom that sentence meant that when 2 or 3 of you are gathered together, I will be there as the third or fourth invisible person. But there's another way of understanding that sentence, which is if 2 or 3 of you are gathered together in an intentional community, committed towards creating a better world, you could call that God. And I'm sort of comfortable with that. I have a pretty weak supernatural commitment, but I'm also pretty strongly committed to the view that we understand just a little bit of the world around us.
At school, what, particularly from about the age of 16 to 18, when you sort of go into a channel, what were the subjects you most interested you?
So when I was 16, I thought I was going to be an ethologist and a sort of a Conrad Lorenzian kind of studier of animal communication. When I was 18, I thought I would be a philosopher. We don't specialize, we don't choose a subject in an American university, so when I arrived at Harvard, I thought I was going to be a philosopher, a student of philosophy. And I had the kind of experience you can only have at the age of 18, which is that I read the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, and I thought that Kant had cheated. I
didn't catch that. You read what?
That Kant read a short book called the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, something.
Yes.
Maybe I'm
by Kant, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm mangling the title. Yeah. And I thought, and as you know, Kant presupposes that there is a kind of constraint on the way that humans understand what is real. And he, as a young person, I thought he was pulling this out of the air. He didn't have evidence for this. He was just saying that he thought that this is the way people worked. And so somewhere around this time, I also came across Gödel's there's this little short book on Gödel's uncertainty principle that moved me. I can't remember, by Nagel? Not by Nagel. By Neumann, maybe. I don't know. I've forgotten. And that persuaded me that there was something complicated to say about human cognition and the way in which humans grasp the world. And I came across a book by Piaget about the way that cognition is structured in certain ways, but is changed by the environment. And for some reason, this propelled me into folklore and mythology. So I became really persuaded that the stories that we tell each other about the world, which are different in each social domain, really shape how we think, but that we didn't really understand how this worked. And so that's what I ended up doing in college, taking a lot of anthropology courses, taking a lot of courses on mythology. Albert Lord, the singer of tales, was in residence when I was a student. And I've always been interested in this mixture of the kind of the human constraint on how we think and feel, and the cultural variability, the way in which that's tweaked and manipulated and altered by culture, and the way that individuals are both, I don't think of culture as a cookie cutter, and I don't think of the ideas people have in cultures is constrained by geography. But I think that there are but I knew at the time that these stories, these accounts, these explanations that were shared within a group shaped the way in which individuals kind of made sense of their world. And I think that also gave to me what's been a pretty distinctive question for me, which is how the world becomes real for people. So I remember when I was young, and I should say something else about when I was young. So I had this mom who, I had a grandparent. You had these grandparents who had very different views about what was ultimately real, and my my mother's sisters are, I mean, you would have called them fundamentalist Christians. They had a very unvarnished understanding of God. I was also at the time living in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, because that's where the best school was outside of New York. And all my friends were Jewish. And I was what was called a Shabbos Goy. So I would go, so if you're an Orthodox Jew, you can't touch electricity and or money, or go to the movies between sundown on Friday and sundown on Saturday. But it doesn't violate, your sense of a relation. It is perfectly acceptable within the faith to have a little Goyisha girl come over, turn on and off the lights, give her a lovely dinner. And so I kind of did that. And I could tell that all these smart, good people had very different understandings of what was real, and that really grabbed me.
At Harvard, were there any of the anthropologists in particular who I might know of, or others who influenced you considerably?
So Stanley Tambaya, Evan Vogt, Albert Lord.
Was David Mabry Lewis there then?
He was. I did not travel in his circles so much. I never took a class with him. I did take Tambi's course on magic, science, and religion, and that has been, I felt he stopped short, but that has been an enduring interest of mine. And then when I came to Cambridge, I became friendly with Geoffrey Lloyd, and so Tambi was an important friend to him, and that sort of continued his influence in my life. Daniel Bell was a powerful influence. I ended up sort of taking care of his house for like 5 or 6 summers. And so, what
was he like as a person? He's a hero of all of us.
Well, he was very, he's a little bit like you. He was very comfortable with generalization. He liked strong views about what happened in a certain world. And he was impatient with quibbling with the details. And he was proud of that. He was always, there's a film about he and Nathan Glazer and Irving Kristol and somebody else called Arguing the World. And that's what he did. He argued, but he was also a really good dad kind of character. So he argued the world with young people, but he also kind of wanted you to win. So he was a good mentor.
All this that you've described so far has been very serious and pretty academic. Are there other hobbies, interests at school or later that have attracted you? I mean, music or art or any of those kinds of things?
Well, I played the violin for 12 years, and also the guitar and the piano and the recorder. But I do remember arriving at college and thinking, okay, there are people who take this very seriously, and this is this is taking too much time. I think as time has gone on, when I was young, I was always fascinated by herbariums and herbalist, Culpeper's herbal. and I used to collect plants and try to think about their meaning and learn their meaning, and and what they meant and what they were used for medicinally. I'm now a pretty active gardener, and so we've got. I'm going to have we have an acre plot, and much of that is gardened. And so it's California gardening, which means increasingly we have succulents. But before I discovered gardening, I had discovered orchids and succulents. When I moved from the University of California, San Diego to the University of Chicago, I mailed 400 succulents and 200 orchids. And I loved the way that the roots of the orchids moved. And they were so extraordinary. They were so unexpected, these plants. I loved the weirdness of these straight, like the Haworthias and the agaves and they're all of these succulents that they shouldn't be as they are, and so I just loved them and I collected them. And I remember that there was at some point when my social life had done what social lives do for young women, I remember turning to collecting plants, and I would have what felt like a little green light at the back of my eyes come on when I would go into a nursery, and I would feel that like something came over me, and I must have one of these brassios, and then that brassivola, and that dendronium, and I would just collect them and keep them and tend to them and nurture them, and I became utterly fascinated. And then when I actually acquired land, the plants I'd collected, should have been weeded out. I still have plants orchids I've owned for 30 years. I mean, these are just not so many, but I still have all, many of them have died, but I still have a kind of a group of plants that are decades old. But now I have, I have a garden. And one of the things that is so lovely about a garden is that it changes time. So Penelope Lively thinks that gardens overcome time. I don't think that's true. I think that gardens make time for you, and they because they're always changing. So you have a plot that one year, I remember planting, digging up the lawn, because we were all supposed to do that in California, and planting, I think it was Carex pansa, which is a sort of this a grass that is drought tolerant, and really working to plant that grass, and then discovering and it looked beautiful for a season. Then the next season it looked terrible, and so I pulled it all out, and then I planted these succulents, and these I think the common name for one of them was a fire stick, and there was I forgot what I planted, but then it froze that year, which it never does. They all died, and then and so there are years when that patch looks beautiful, and the rain has been perfect, so that the roses and the California poppies and the grasses just they come to their fullness at the same time, and it's gorgeous. And then there are other years where it looks terrible, and so and you just I've lost a sister at this point, and who was a children's book writer and fantastically successful, millions and millions of books, and it was a real loss to lose her, because she was always at her desk, and so we could talk every day as I was walking in and out to the university. And having a garden really helped me to manage that loss, because the garden, pieces of the garden die and they come back and they change, and it's different plants, and that's important.
and for me too. Coming on to Cambridge, you mentioned Geoffrey Lloyd, but who is your supervisor?
Ernest Gilner. So Stephen Hugh Jones and Ernest Gilner. So Stanley Tambaya had said to me.
So it started with Stephen and then?
Yes. And, by topic, I really should have worked with you. But Tamby had said, there's a bright young man at Cambridge that you should work with. And so I was like, okay. And so I'd signed up to work with Stephen. And but then Stephen went on leave. And also I had this interest not only in witchcraft and magic, but in rationality, which was not so central. So Stephen was always a good friend and a good advisor, but at some point he said, I'm going on leave, Ernest is going to be your supervisor. He's going to take over. He does rationality. And so and so at the time, the rationality debate was very active. It was completely swept out of the way by cognitive science, which was a different way of thinking about cognition. But Ernest became my supervisor.
Tell me about Ernest as a supervisor.
He was wonderful. I think I remember, I'd come back to, he was quite idiosyncratic, and he was also very blunt. And so...
what year is this?
This must have been 1985.
Yeah.
And so I remember, so there are three memories that really stick out. One memory is arriving at Cambridge, having written 50,000 words on my thesis. And Ernest said to me, having just met me, you will do our student colloquium because you have something to say. And I said, no, I don't have anything to say. And he said, you have 50,000 words. You can lead this discussion. And then another memory is, so I would write a chapter, and then I would give it to him, and I would meet with him. And I remember it. Young people are so foolish, and we write in such crabbed, awkward ways, and we're so attracted to theoretical debates here and there. And so I gave him my chapter, and Ernest sat me down and said, so tell me what the point of this chapter is. And I explained it, and he sort of looked at me and he said, good, why didn't I get that out of your chapter? I was like, oh, I'll go revise that. But and then another, and I gave the department's third really strong memory I have is giving the department seminar after I'd finished my thesis, because we used to do that then. If the student would give the department seminar. And I was a very anxious young anthropologist, and I gave the talk, and in retrospect, I can see that the talk was very successful because of what people were saying. But at the time, I was convinced that it was just a tissue of kind of, suppositions. And I remember Ernest walking me home and just, pounding his stick into the ground and saying, that was a very good talk. You should be proud.
How nice.
It was really lovely.
Yeah, well, that's great. So why did you choose witchcraft? Tell us something about your PhD and the book.
So I had taken this class with Stanley Tambaya, and Tambaya had this point, he was delivering the received wisdom of the field, is that witches people had magic if they didn't have science, or if the magic was purely symbolic. They didn't really believe in the magic. And somewhere around this time, I came across a book that told you how to be a witch, that was published it was published by an American, it was written by an American, it was published by a serious press, and it had all sorts of instructions about how to practice magic. And that didn't seem to fit in either of these two theories. I loved Evans Pritchard. I thought that oracles of witchcraft, magic, and oracles, whatever it was still is one of the best ethnographies I think that we have. And and I was so intrigued by these. I guess at the time I just I'd arrived at Cambridge. I'd come with this book. I was intrigued by this puzzle. I loved Evans Pritchard, and I think it might have been you. Was it you? I started talking about witchcraft. And I think it might have been that you that said, "Oh, I know somebody who knows somebody. You should go talk to her." And I did that, and I discovered that there was this whole world of people, who were. I was this naive American. Here I was in this exotic culture, which was England. And I knew that this culture was quite different. It was totally fascinating. Silence means something quite different here than it does in the country of my origin. And I could tell that. So I went to meet this woman. I learned from her. Actually, she introduced me to somebody else. So the woman that I was introduced to lived out in the fens. And she had this, 17th century cottage and like 12 cats and an altar and a knife stained with her own blood. And she made wine in the bathtub. And, so she was quite colorful, but she was a story. She wasn't a culture. But she introduced me to somebody else who sent me off to this lecture, which turned out to be a conference with all these people in some hall in London. And there were clearly 1,000 or more people who talked about magic and grimoires and witchcraft and spells and this was this was a world. And so I thought this would be totally cool, because you could not give the kind of explanation that Tabby had given for magic about this world. These were very sophisticated people living in a very these are pretty educated people practicing magic. So and then what happened was that I started, I became part of this world. I got initiated as a witch and a high magician and a Kabbalist and goodness knows what, and which was that was fun. But I also had gone into that world with ideas about narrative, with the idea that stories, models, shared understandings, cognitive stuff would explain how you could start as a non-magician and end up as a magician. And I provided I thought that was true, but what I also found was that if you hung out in this world, you would feel magic. You would feel magic running through your body. You would see things other people didn't see. And I didn't quite understand how to make sense of it, but it was really important.
Was it true? I mean, did you feel magic?
Yeah. I mean, what would happen, for example, I'll tell a few stories. So, one of the first examples was that I was Cambridge, the 80s. I had a bicycle. Of course, these people were in London. I was living in Cambridge in the beginning. I had a bicycle. I would ride to the train station, and I had 2 bicycle lights, which were at the time were these pretty heavy things. You'd snap them onto your bike, and you'd take them off of your bike to get on the train because they were worth £5 and people would steal them. So I had cycled to the station, took off my lights, put them in my bag. I'm on the train and I am reading the book of this adept that I'm going to go meet. It's called The Experience of Inner Worlds, and the book is about magical this and Kabbalistic that and Tibetan whatnot and the Holy Spirit and all about power that moves through you. And here I am alone in the train, really trying to wrap my head around this book and really trying to understand from the inside what this book is about. And I started to feel fabulous. I started to feel that there was an electric current that was running through me, that was just, I felt completely alive. My senses were exquisitely attuned. I felt fully present. It felt really different. It felt like something. I felt like there was this stuff, this substance. And then the startling thing was that in this process, the smoke started coming out of my bag. And it turned out that one of the batteries was melting. And so I have no explanation for the batteries, but I mean, it was liquefying. The experience is real. Other people had this experience. It's not so well described. It's like in the Christian world, it's sometimes called a Holy Spirit experience, but people talk about it as a bolt of lightning or electricity that runs through you, and it's a real experience. There's another experience that I write about in the book. I'm like buried on page 300 and something or other, that in this world, you were really meant to read literature as if you were living inside. You were not meant to be sitting back and thinking, oh, how does George Eliot paint the protagonists of Middlemarch? How does she portray this woman? You're meant to live the story. And so I had been reading the novels appropriate for having this experience at the time. And I was reading this book called The Mists of Avalon, which is about a retelling by a member of this community, a witch, a retelling of the Arthurian legend. And so I was vividly engaged in the book. And I went to sleep. And I woke up in the morning and I saw 6 druids standing by the window. And so the technical name for this experience is that it's a hypnopompic experience. So these are not so rare, but often I could spin you a tale about when they're memorable and when they're not. But for me, I had the phenomenal experience. I felt that what felt to me was that this was not my thought, not my dream, but as something that I saw in the world, and it felt like a veridical, empirical sight. It felt I was using my senses. And so I remember snapping out of bed, and then everything changing. And then I wrote it down in my fieldwork journal, my diary, and underline, I really saw this. And then I went back to sleep, and I sort of forgot about it. And until later in the day, I woke up, I went around my world, and I remembered it. I was like, right, I really had this experience. And other people in that world also had experiences like that. And so that became a rabbit that I've really tried to follow. What's the relationship between the ideas that you have, what you could call your cognitions, your propositions, and your felt experiential awareness of the world? And can you train those? It seemed to me that I hung out in this magical world and I learned to have those experiences, even though I felt the experiences were spontaneous and unchosen. I didn't decide to have a hallucination. I didn't decide to feel that power came to me. But there was some relationship between living in this social world, learning to pay attention as I had done, and having these vivid experiences. And so this question about belief, training, experience really has stayed with me.
It has stayed with you because it seems to lead directly into your later works, which are about fundamentalist Christians and how they persuade themselves that they believe in God and so on. Can you tell me something about that later work?
Yes. So I wrote a book about India where I was trying to study religion but got sidetracked by the community. And I wrote a book about psychiatry, and it's worth mentioning briefly because what happened in my book on psychiatry is that I became a little bit more alert to the fact that you can study how people have odd experiences, that there are methods and there are ways of thinking about this. So after I finished the psychiatry book, I started to do two things at the same time. I spent time in, so the psychiatry book was about the training of young psychiatrists. And somebody said to me, but really it's the patients who count. You should study the patients. And when I arrived at the University of Chicago, somebody Richard Taub, drove me to a neighborhood with the densest concentration of persons with psychosis in the entire state of Illinois. And he said, you should study this. And at the same time, it had sort of dawned on me that what my magicians were doing in London was also at the heart of this big movement in Christianity that is global, but was a big deal in America, which is Charismatic Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so I started searching for a church where people said that God would talk back. And so here I am on the streets of Chicago, dressed in a hoodie, trying to blend in with homeless psychotic women. But I find a church, Vineyard Christian Fellowship, where it's pretty clear to me that most people weren't psychotic, where it was a very dull church on the surface. We met like in a community hall. There was no churchy stuff. There's a PowerPoint. The pastor is not giving theatrical sermons. He is teaching from the text. He's really trying to explain the text, but he's also saying things like, you should get to know God. You should get to know God the way you would get to know anyone. Go have a cup of coffee with God. Put out a second, in the morning. You've got your cup of coffee, and God has his cup of coffee, and pour an actual cup of coffee and sit and talk to God and listen to what he has to say.
Does he drink it?
Well, not Elijah. He did not. No, but and people were very sophisticated and subtle about that. But it was also clear that they would learn to experience God as speaking, and so I became quite fascinated by, people are doing something like hearing voices, which the women on the street are doing, but it's a different kind of experience. So they are learning to, at the advice of the pastor and all of these and there are hundreds of manuals that will teach you how to do this. And people they say things like, God's voice sounds like the flow of your own thought. You just have to pick out what are God's words. And so people would learn to look for, and I became aware there's a texture to thought. They would learn to pick out the words that stood out, that sort of popped out, that felt louder or stronger. And it seemed to me that as they learned to do this, that inner experience got more and more different from them and felt more loud or more strong, and there were variations. Sometimes that voice was super clear and it really did not feel like them. And sometimes the voice, maybe it really was just what they were thinking. And people would joke about this. Maybe it's God, maybe it's the burrito that I was eating for lunch. It was, they knew that there's all this human stuff, that it would intervene between what they took to be the creator. And there was all this subtle thinking. But people would get better at picking out God's voice, recognizing God's voice, and about a third of them said that at least once God had spoken to them in a way they could hear with their ears. And so that was really interesting to me. And the other thing that was really interesting was that it was clear that some people could do this and some people couldn't. Some people, I would sit in prayer group, and there was a young man who would say, I was his prayer partner, and we prayed once that he would hear God speak in a booming voice because God just never spoke to him. And there was another woman who, she loved this, and she was what was called a prayer warrior. She was a well-established, everyone knew she prayed really well, and she heard God really easily. And so that became something I really wanted to understand. And then that's when I started adding other disciplinary methods to the work, because when I said this to people who weren't anthropologists, they didn't believe me. So they didn't think that what I had was really data, because they thought that what anthropologists could do was to, understand what a group of people would talk about together, the ideas that they shared, but that I couldn't really pull out individual differences in a way that would persuade people.
So what were the other methods? You mean sociological or psychological?
Psychological. So I started to, there was some interdisciplinary group where I tried to I gave a talk. And people were very sympathetic, but they said, this is not really evidence. And so I said, okay. So that affronted me. And I was like, I'm going to prove that this is true. I'm going to prove that I've really seen something that happens. What would persuade you? And so they suggested, and then I actually talked to my dad. I was like, they seem to think that what questionnaires do people use when they're interested in this? And he suggested a whole set of questionnaires. And I was to talk to the psychologist, Howard Nussbaum, who said, well, if you were doing this as a psychologist, you would ask the same questions of every person, of a group of people, and then you'd try to understand whether there are differences. And he said, well, if you're as a psychologist, you would give them all the same questionnaires. You'd talk to them, and you are an anthropologist, he said, you know what counts as an expert. If you give them the questionnaires and put them to the side, and then say to yourself, is this person I've talked to, is this person an expert? And then look at how they've answered those questionnaires and see if there's a relationship. And what I did was, so I did two things. First, so I started using these questionnaires, and some of the questionnaires made people feel crazy, or made them feel that I thought that they were crazy. And some of the questionnaires they answered all the same way, so that wasn't very interesting. But there was one that was really interesting. It was called the absorption scale, and the guy who said, so it's about whether so it's really interesting. What does this scale actually capture? But there are items like, sometimes I feel experience the world the way I did as a child, or I can turn noise into music by the way that I listen to it, or sometimes I can sense the presence of somebody before I know that they're there, things like that. Sometimes the sound of a voice is so fascinating to me I can follow it, as if forever. And so I would give this scale to people, and the guy who said, "Oh, God doesn't talk to me," reads the scale, and he says, true to 4 out of the 34 items, and he puts down the scale and he looks at me and he says, "There are people like this." And the prayer warrior, the woman who everybody thought was a fabulous prayer, said yes to almost everything, and then said, "The man who wrote this scale lives in my head. He knows who I am." And so that was really interesting to me. And then I continued to work with that scale, trying to say, okay, what does it pick up? And it turns out now, I've recently ran this huge project. The absorption no matter what religious faith, in this big project that I did in 5 countries with people who were charismatic Christians and non-Christians, the way somebody answered the absorption scale was related to how vividly they experienced God. So I think that's really cool. There's something really important there. And the other thing that I did, pushed by my non-anthropology friends was to do a training study. So I was pretty persuaded that you join these groups and you change. There's something about the way you pay attention that changes. And so I got over 100 charismatic evangelical Christians, the kind who want an intimate back and forth relationship with God. One by one, got them into my office and gave them these computer exercises and gave them a set of surveys and talked to them for hours. And then I gave them a brown paper envelope, which had a spiritual discipline. It was either these immersive, imagination-rich prayers, which are a lot like what the witches were doing, but also were a lot like the way people were praying. But I was structuring them. So you would, had half an hour of recorded stuff. And people, for example, in one of them, you'd listen to the 23rd Psalm, and then I would lead in my voice, and then they never actually met me. My voice would say, okay, the Lord is my shepherd. See the shepherd before you. Look at the slope of his shoulders. Look at his hair. Now he turns and follows. You follow him. And I would lead. I would do Ignatian spiritual exercises with the 23rd Psalm. And then the other, another envelope had these pretty fabulous lectures on the Gospels from the teaching company. Same amount of time. And then there was another condition, which was a more centering prayer condition. And then so people would go out for a month, and they have to do this for half an hour a day. And they came back in, and we redid all those measures. And in a way that, and then it turned out that the people in the prayer condition, they looked different. They came back with more vivid experiences of God, few more unusual experiences. And then absorption also worked in that setting, seemed to also predict these experiences. And so that became really important. And then later, I decided, it turns out there's this deep puzzle about the relation of psychosis and let's call it absorption or imagination, whatever the skill is being trained in the charismatic church, and by the witches and by the Zoroastrians and by many, let's call it a human skill, the capacity to be caught up in your inner senses and to suspend disbelief. There's a puzzle about how that relates to psychosis, and I'm still in the midst of trying to understand this, but I think there's a real answer to be given. In the course of that, as I began thinking about this, I began thinking, okay, I think there's something about the way that people imagine their minds that's really important here. And that culture invites you to think about your mind differently in different social worlds. And so this big project, it's hard to be an anthropologist and really do a definitive study of training, because these days that really happens in the neuroscience world. So that's Richie Davidson, and I'm now partnering with people, and actually we're doing some of these fMRIs and trying to look at the relationship between different experiences. But that I knew that if I were going to be true to my anthropological roots, I could anthropologically look at different cultural understandings of the mind and really get some traction with that, really try to really understand that. And so this big project came around because I was interested in whether the way people thought about their mind was also connected to these spiritual experiences. And maybe that would help to speak to the puzzle of psychosis. And so we did this. The most recent thing I've done is this 5-country study in which we've got a language-competent, seasoned ethnographer in each site. And then they have a small team of people. And so the ethnographer really knows the area well, and then has asked questions and so we use different methods in this site. So there was the ethnographer is sitting with 60 people, people of deep faith, very committed, and ask questions about how they think about the mind, and then also questions about how they experience whatever God or spirit is at the center of their faith. And then we did another version of those questions where we trained research assistants to stand.
We're just getting towards the last 2 minutes.
Oh, sorry about that. Oh, right. Well, it's the end time isn't so. I'm not so. But so we trained research assistants to ask short versions of those questions to the general population, and we gave undergraduates these surveys that they filled out. And what we found is that in each of these settings, absorption was associated with spiritual experience. But we also discovered that if you imagined your mind as porous, as sort of open to the world, you were also, if you have affirmed cultural statements, salient statements like, if you wish hard enough, you can win the lottery, or special people, when they look at food, they can poison it. And the more you affirm that, the more you also have these intense experiences. So I feel like I'm in your tradition and in Ernest Gellner's tradition, and I'm contributing to the conversation.
What a lovely ending.